Hi, the following content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. If you are a healthcare provider, please consult with your affiliated institution or local ethics committee for ethical guidance related to clinical practice.
Hello, bioengineering ethics or ethics in general enthusiasts. Today we're talking about biological bycatch. What is that? You will find out, and hopefully you've done the readings. Let's go to the iPad and go to Dr. Magnus. One moment, please. Boom, boom, and good. Can you see the screen?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, go for it.
Okay, new topic. Very exciting. Okay.
Bycatch reminds me of fishing.
It's funny if you try and do searches for like ethics and bycatch, you get a lot about fishery ethics. So that is not what we're talking about today.
Okay.
So, so if for those of you who are really interested in a deeper dive into this literature, it is a little tricky. I mean, there is bycatch literature itself that you can find. Although, as I've indicated, it's sometimes mixed in with other literatures. But basically, you have to look into several different places. Something's called eDNA or environmental DNA, where it's DNA of human DNA captured from water, air, and sand.
I'm sorry. My thing is out of control here. I just have to. Okay, I'm sorry. I fell behind. I don't usually fall behind. There's a good paper that we wanted to recommend. I'm trying to remember who the author was.
It's in the reading. That one's gonna be assigned.
Okay, so that's Whitmore et al.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that.
So
and now,
you'll have that in your reading.
Right? What is biological bycatch? Go ahead.
Okay, so in terms of finding the ethics literature, some of it is in the eDNA or environmental DNA literature. This is again DNA about human DNA captured from sources in the water, the air, sand, whatever. There's also a bunch of ethics literature that's relevant from wastewater surveillance and research. So there's that literature. And then
that's very hot because in an ongoing way, it's relevant to COVID, especially.
Exactly. And in fact, gave rise to a fairly large ethics literature about COVID surveillance using wastewater, which was generally regarded as a much better estimate of COVID rates in communities than testing rates and positivity rates in testing. And then there's microbiome research. There's a lot of work on the ethics of microbiomes. I've been to many microbiome ethics research. When my wife asks me what I'm going to do, and I say microbiome, and she looks puzzled, I tell her I'm going to a poop genomics meeting. Is a good way of describing it. But what's interesting is most of the bioethics literature about the microbiome has really not focused on bycatch. It's really focused a lot on the direct collection of gut and saliva samples from sets of individuals.
So bycatch would be that you're taking the poop, and the poop has a ton of DNA from the host, and they just haven't worried about that very much.
They have some, but they were still thinking of it as like capturing it directly from an individual rather than collecting it at a population level, like from sewage.
It's true that the first two are population level.
Yeah. So that's where the ethics literature is. And although it comes from all these different sources and it's often published in different places because of that, the ethics literature actually overlaps a lot and is pretty similar. And we're going to try and synthesize a lot of that literature for you here. A second set of distinctions that's important is distinctions between bycatch that's a function of focusing on genetic genomic information from a particular individual, that is their bycatch, their stuff that they've thrown away, which we're really not as focused on here, but like
they're garbage.
Yeah, they're garbage. Or, the police are surveilling somebody. There's a TV show called what's it called? Blue Bloods, and there's an episode at some point where they turned the heat up and made it and the air conditioning off to make a guy sweat, so they could capture some of his ambient sweat, so they could do a DNA analysis of it to see if he was guilty of a crime where they had some crime DNA. So that'd be something where you'd be focused on an individual, or if there's somebody running for elected office and you want to know about something about their genomes, and you managed to grab a Coke can that they had thrown away.
Right.
There is a bunch of interesting legal literature about that and about whether or not the DNA belongs to you or whether it's like other parts of trash. Once you've thrown it away and put it in the garbage can and put it out on the street, it no longer belongs to you and it's fair game for people to go through. But if you toss something into the garbage can, the thing itself doesn't belong to you anymore. It's not 100% clear whether that applies to the DNA or not. And in fact, there's in the legal literature, there's debates about who owns that. Anyway, so that's really the individually focused stuff. Then there's the more population level, which could turn out to give you information on individuals, but it's population focus on capturing genetic or genomic information or other biological or medical information from a population. So that would be things like studying wastewater rates for COVID infection in a population. That would be an example of Bycatch focused on a population. And we've seen lots of publication rates. They do that on Stanford campus, right? So they've studied the rates of COVID in the wastewater at Stanford on campus from all the, excrement that you guys have produced to detect what the rates of COVID are.
Yes, I believe a guest on my podcast is a faculty member who orchestrated a lot of that in civil and environmental engineering.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. I knew Bonnie Maldonado was involved in it.
Yeah, and she worked with this other woman. Yes.
Okay, interesting. And then lastly, there's what we could kind of think of as sort of incidental human bycatch, where you're not really focused on capturing information about humans, but human DNA is captured as a byproduct of studying non-human organisms or studying the environment. And this is something that has gotten a lot of attention around bycatch because people who are interested in looking at the DNA and ecosystems and doing all these analyses around other organisms keep finding human DNA in quite large quantities in a lot of those organisms they're looking through, or the waters and other things, other ecosystems that they're looking through, and then they have a lot of information about humans. Sometimes that incidental information about humans is just left alone and ignored. Sometimes, since they've got it there, even though that was not a primary object of study, once they've got it, they sometimes study that in relation to some of the things that they were interested in. So that would be an example of that, and that's pretty common. In the article you've got to read for today, it talks a bit about some of that kind of research. Okay, another set of distinctions is distinctions in the uses of the attempt to identify human DNA in bycatch, right? So sometimes it's used for public health surveillance, as with finding rates of COVID, finding rates of tuberculosis, finding rates of any of other diseases in populations found in wastewater, finding rates of illicit drug use, which will raise issues that we'll talk about. That's a very active area of research. It can sometimes also be used, in addition to public health surveillance, for criminal investigations, as we've already mentioned examples where you can use some of these samples to try and hone in on somebody who you think might be a criminal and identify them through their DNA. And then lastly, you could be doing just basic research, important research that may eventually in the long term have public health implications, but in the short term is really for producing research results about the environment or individuals. And you hope that that will eventually lead to things that will benefit humans or the environment. But that's really the idea behind the research. Okay, with all of that in background, with all the range of things that go on in bycatch, let's talk about some of the major ethical issues and challenges. And these were early on in the quarter, so hopefully these will start to seem similar to issues that are raised by other technologies, and you'll start to think about some of the tools that we're giving you for how to think systematically about things. And you can see when you look at this literature that these same sets of considerations, some slightly organized differently, or sometimes slightly altered in the wording, nonetheless overlap a lot, as you'd expect, derived from similar ethics sources. So one of the major ethical issues and challenges that gets talked about a lot is data privacy and stewardship. So that's probably the number one issue that you see when people talk about bycatch. We know that re-identification is getting easier. that from if you've got anything like genomic data, for example, it's definitely hard to really see increasingly any kind of genome-wide sequence data as being de-identified. It's gotten so that you can, with other publicly available resources, identify individuals. Russ, do you want to say something more about that?
No, we have some lectures on re-identification that we will make available to the students, either as a technical briefing or just as an FYI if you're interested in some extra material. But it talks about how the emerging network of databases makes it extremely difficult in general to stop re-identification and including with genomic information.
Yeah, so it's getting harder and harder to really, with a straight face, talk about de-identified data.
But it's not one of the 19. The genome is not one of the 19 HIPAA things, but it falls under that last category, David's favorite, which is anything else that could reasonably be expected to be identified.
Yeah, and right now people are still treating as if it isn't, but I think that's got an expiration date on it. And
Yes.
I don't know how much longer. A lot of folks at NIH already have basically put their flag down on the stance that this is all identifiable, and regulations are starting to percolate in that direction. As you know very well, we'll be
It's
talking.
hugely inconvenient, even if it's true.
Yeah, that's right. We'll be talking in I think next week or two about or actually this week we're going to be talking about newborn screening, and that's an example of where the government has now said that sequencing that kind of material is automatically identifiable. So and so the regulations there have changed. So we'll be talking about that coming up soon. Actually, you will have probably already heard those lectures and heard us talk about that by the time you're watching these
Yeah, we
videos.
got to keep this module evergreen. So no outward references.
Okay, there we go. So there's some examples of things that are very sensitive. There are very active studies going on of using wastewater to study rates of illicit drug use in populations. There are active researchers using some of this material, so, things like wastewater and other kinds of bycatch from rivers and streams and areas to allow them to study indigenous populations without having to get necessarily consent, which we'll be talking about in a minute, from those populations. Uh, um, so
Wait
those,
a minute, is that happening in the United States?
yes.
Who the heck would do a study of an indigenous group through their wastewater and not just going up to them and saying, could I please study you?
It's very hard to get most tribes. There's a few exceptions
Right, but
agree to this
right, but
research.
but going to the wastewater seems like it
Well,
would
or I don't think this is from wastewater. I think this might be from like just rivers,
rivers.
and going to areas where there happen to be these populations living.
There
And
you go. That's a good way to build trust, don't you agree?
good way to build trust. It's also happened in other countries with indigenous populations.
Oh, that's easy to imagine, but this is the US of A.
This is not hard for me to imagine in the U.S. of
Right,
A.
I know.
Uh,
Okay.
and then people are also worried when you have these identifiable data and what people might do who are motivated. Will people start to look at like, gosh, I wonder how much Plan B is in, metabolites or whatever, anything that might indicate that somebody ingested Plan B or is in the water in a particular population. And you can imagine if you could zero in, especially in communities where, or states where Plan B is now unlawful, that this could be a way of targeting women who have gotten unlawful abortions in those states, or other sorts of things. So these are all examples of some of the potential harms and why people worry about maintaining privacy and stewardship and care about what kind of research takes place, as well as who controls it and how it's being controlled. And then, as I've already indicated, from a legal standpoint, the question of who owns your waste, and in particular your DNA that's in your waste, is an open question from a legal standpoint. There's a lot of ways in which it does make sense to think of it as like other items of waste, where once you've thrown it away, it's not yours anymore. Once you flush, it's not yours anymore. But not everybody agrees that that's the right framework. And so there's a lot of consideration about what the right approach ought to be to that issue. Okay, so lots of stuff about data privacy and stewardship. Next set of major ethical issues and challenges are really about consent, which is very closely tied to these issues about privacy and stewardship. So one way of sort of addressing some of the concerns around privacy and stewardship is to just get very explicit informed consent. So if people say, yes, you can use my microbiome data, yes, you can use anything that you've collected from me, that would be one way of establishing that you've got the right to do that kind of research. However, the more, if you actually make that a requirement, that may make it difficult or even impossible to conduct valuable research or to engage in important surveillance activities. I mean, I already mentioned that there's active surveillance activities going on for COVID in the waste of Stanford students. That has been going on for some time as research. I don't know if anybody's studying illicit drug use among Stanford students, but that could very well be an interesting area of research, and people might study that to just see the degree to which we're having different kinds of drug problems and what kind, and how we ought to intervene and so on. So those are all things that are actually happening, but none of you consented to it. And truthfully, if you required informed consent, it would make it impossible to do the kind of broad scale population level wastewater studies that we're talking about here. So some people have argued that consent really is an outdated approach to really these kinds of population health and population health research and population health measures that really ought to be in place, and these public health measures that need to be in place. And therefore, we ought to get rid of focusing on notions of consent and recognizing that there are, in fact, obligations that everybody has to contribute to these kinds of efforts in the name of the public good. There are other people who are very concerned about the fact that this is winds up in the hands of researchers likely making these decisions about with potentially limited oversight or very narrowly defined oversight by IRBs, and deciding what sorts of research is appropriate in these populations, especially given that it may turn out to create identifiable data for individuals. Some folks especially representing indigenous populations, have argued that we ought to have a consent process that involves tiered consent for any kind of use of anything that might be identifiable, which would obviously slow down the pace of research. Others that have argued there ought to be broad consent.
What's tiered consent?
That's where you basically lay out a set. You don't go through every possible use, but you lay out sort of types of uses that might be there and see if you can get consent. So, for example, we could have said, since we're doing all this surveillance of students and potentially doing research into the surveillance, whether the surveillance works and what techniques work best for surveillance, we could have just gone to every Stanford student and just said, here's the options for the research we want to do, people want to do at Stanford. We want to do things for public health surveillance. We want to do things for this, and we want to do things to find out about drug use. We want to do this and this, and you give your rationales, and people could say anything related to finding out about diseases and their prevalence, I'm okay with, but don't study drug use in our
Law enforcement. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, gotcha.
things like
Okay,
that.
good.
Anyway, so the debates are ongoing about whether or not stewardship obligations are the primary duty, and therefore no consent is required, versus views that no, we really ought to be trying to find ways of at least doing better job of disclosure, if not consent, and ideally some kind of consent. I will say, if this work, there are some frameworks that have been developed for thinking about the ethics of this, and this is a good opportunity for us to introduce something to you, which you guys should be familiar with, which is something called GDPR, which stands for, what does it stand for?
Oh, geez. I
Uh,
don't
uh,
even know. I can look that up.
it's
It
data privacy regulation. I can never remember the G.
general.
General data privacy regulations. These are obligatory for any activities that take place in the EU. So in Europe, these are data requirements, but many people think that that standard ought to be the universal standard. Other people think it's too restrictive. But basically, when you look at the principles involved in GDPR and the uses of data, they usually require either consent, so that you have permission to use somebody's data for research or any other purposes, or it has to meet some or one or of a number of conditions establishing the necessity, and I'll emphasize that word, it has to be necessary for vital interests, either of, and there's a bunch of different things like vital to an individual who you're trying to protect. Somebody's got this rare disease, they don't know they've got it. We need to do something to find them quick and give them the antidote before they die. Whatever. I'm sure it's the next episode of Mission Impossible or whatever. Or it might be important for the public health or the public interest, or it might be required by law, for example, for tax purposes. You have to maintain data to be able to to have people pay their taxes, things like that. So anyway, so things like that are necessary. That's essentially the GDPR framework, that you have to meet these conditions, which are pretty restrictive.
Doesn't it also have a right to opt out?
Yes, there's a right to opt out.
Which is hugely difficult technically, right? Because if you've built a system and if you are using data to actually rebuild the system without one person's data, not impossible, but a lot of tech companies have spent a lot of money trying to figure out how to do that. And that, I believe, falls under GDPR as well.
Although in practice, if you fall under one of these exceptions, where you're not getting consent, it's sort of like the blood spots. California technically is opt out too, but nobody does it. There's probably
Right.
five people,
Right.
in the whole state who've done that, because nobody knows to do it. In the same way, nobody knows to do it if you fall into one of those very narrow categories. But because those categories are pretty narrowly defined, it means that lots of valuable research doesn't meet that bar. So lots of research that would be allowed in the US, as long as it's de-identified or minimal risk research, is not allowed under GDPR.
Yep.
Interestingly, another general framework for thinking about this besides GDPR is a more public health ethics approach. That approach, so GDPR is very limited because it has to be like necessary for like vital interests, high bar, or you have to get consent. A public health ethics approach basically just requires that the juice has to be worth the squeeze. So if you're going to do this, it better be that you're addressing serious issues, harms are minimized as much as possible, and the benefits outweigh the privacy
When you
risk.
say if you're going to do this, you mean if you're going to not get consent?
Correct.
Okay.
We're just going to say we're going to do some research on wastewater. We've got a project. We're going to do some microbiome research in some water, and study a bunch of human traits. And we're going to study disease prevalence for human disease, based on things that we just find in the air. Whatever it is, it has to be that the juice is worth the squeeze, that the benefits outweigh the risks. That's much more of the kind of thing that IRBs tend to think about in human subjects protection research, and the similar analogous situation arises in sort of a public health ethics approach, which is much less restrictive than the GDPR approach. Right. So public health approaches, it has to be that the benefits outweigh the harms, and that you've minimized it as much as possible and maximize the benefits as much as possible. GDPR, it's like only if it's necessary for vital interests, only then can you really do this. Vital interests of state, vital interests of public health, vital interests of individuals.
Good.
Okay, think we're ready to move on to the next major set of issues?
Yes, we are.
Okay, another set of related things are unintended. In fact, these could all be labeled under unintended consequences, but one of the set of concerns are the potential for unintended consequences. The reading you've got for today talks about one of these that I think is very interesting and quite important and clever, which is when you're out doing environmental research, you're interested in sea turtles and the sands that they walk on and the water that they walk on. And this is a real example. And you want to find out more about the bacteria and what kind of organisms are living in their ecosystem. And so you sequence like whatever's there to try and figure out what kinds of things are in the environment that the sea
It's
tortoises.
often called metagenomics because you're not actually going for one genome. You're going for like the gamish, the mixture of genomes, and so they sometimes call that metagenomics.
So that's exactly right. So metagenomics research. Normally, when you do that kind of research, it's minimal risk. It's not of risk to the animals, the organisms that you're studying, and it doesn't involve humans at all. And so you don't get IRB approval, for example. But now it turns out when you do those studies, you start finding out a bunch of stuff about human DNA, and now you have a whole bunch of information about individuals that may or may not, depending on whether or not sequence data remains potentially de-identified. But as that becomes more and more problematic to maintain, it may very well be that some of this stuff now requires IRB approval. And that's just not something that these like wildlife scientists have ever thought of, that it's just not part of their way of thinking. And so that could be a challenge if it turns out they needed this approval and they didn't get it. I can say that
They
some
probably became wildlife scientists so they could avoid humans.
Yeah, that's it's interesting. I will say a surprising that it's not the majority of what I wind up investigating, but there are things where like there's human subject stuff where people who aren't used to thinking of themselves as doing anything involved in human subjects and then violated the regulations that I do in fact wind up having to deal with. So this could be a
Like in the hospital or at the
uh,
medical school.
or in the medical school. This is
Yeah,
mostly researchers doing stuff outside of a hospital setting,
right, right.
but nonetheless count as human subjects research. They had to get IRB approval where they didn't think they needed it. Anyway, so that could be a problem. Moreover, it will add new regulatory hurdles for this research, which runs a potential risk, right? That's the trade-off, right? You can understand why that might be a good thing because people who are not used to having to deal with human data and ensuring privacy and all that kind of stuff, you might want some of that oversight. But on the other hand, it's a whole new set of regulatory requirements that may slow down the pace of wildlife genomics research.
Right.
So anyway, so that could be interesting. Other unintended consequences include the potential for inadvertent privacy breach and location breaches. And there's a lot of people. There's a guy, somebody I know, just has a book that he published. Eric, I can put an ad for his digital health book. Let's see if people can see this. Anyway,
Oh, you're gonna no, it got who's
Eric,
the author?
Eric Praxlis. Do you know Eric?
No, it's called Digital Health.
Called Digital Health. But anyway, it's called Understanding the Benefit Risk Patient Provider Framework. But anyway, but he
How do
does
you spell the last name?
it's spelled Prakslis.
P-E-R.
AkSlis.
Oh yeah, he worked at the FDA for a while. I do know him, yes.
Yeah, he did, and then he was
He
at
was the
Harvard.
chief data scientist at the FDA
Yes,
for like a cup of coffee.
and then he left there to go work for at Harvard for a while, and now he's just left Harvard about 6 months ago, and he's working for a private company. But
Yes, it's called regulatory capture.
anyway, yeah. So he's really good. He's on the IRB for the All of Us program, and it's pretty interesting, and it's been very educational to see how many people don't really know what they're doing, who you would think would know what they're doing in terms of being able to stop information from flowing, especially about location, things like that. It actually has led me to be quite scared about like things like my Apple Watch that I'm not wearing right now, and even my phone, and the ways in which we're
Well,
being
the
served.
military was worried about this because they had military guys wearing watches, and that was giving the enemy information about our camps.
Yeah, I never know who the enemy is these days.
Right. I'm leaving that broad and vague.
In America, I think that means the opposite party. So, yeah. Anyway, okay. Then another whole set of things that are kind of like unintended consequences, but sometimes they're kind of intended bad
Right,
consequences.
right. Intended consequences.
Intended bad consequences, which is the potential for misuse. And that's really ways in which you could use some of this information to surveil individuals genomically.
Yeah.
You could surveil groups like different ethnic groups or other populations, right? So you can imagine got repressive governments being interested in using this. So those are all examples, or unethical commercialization. And I don't think there's any other place where we talk about the Moore cell line. So I think it might be worth just briefly talking about the Mo cell line. So this guy, John Moore, was a guy who had hairy cell leukemia, and he had, I think it was his spleen removed when he was at UCLA. And then this was a long time ago, so it was pre-IRB days, but not by much. It was like 70s, or I think it was late 70s or early 80s. Anyway, he uh, um, started to get suspicious or found it odd. He moved away from Southern California to Oregon, and they kept asking him to fly down and offering to pay for him to fly down to Southern California so they could collect like hair samples and blood samples and saliva samples. And then one day he did that, and they gave him, he had never signed a consent form for any of this. And then one day they handed him a consent form saying basically, we have all commercial rights to anything we got from you. And so he got suspicious, refused to sign, and hired a lawyer, and found out that the UCLA researchers had created something called the Mo cell line for John Moore, and had
Is
commercialized
it
it,
MO?
Mo cell line.
Yep.
And it had become the basis of the creation of a company called Genentech, which many of you are familiar with. But the Mo cell line was the original basis of, or part of the original basis of the creation of Genentech out of the value of
Was it UCLA or UCSF?
UCLA.
Okay.
But they licensed it to
Right.
other people. So anyway, it was interesting. It wound up going to the California Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said basically, once this is out of your body, it does not belong to you. And so that he had no rights. They did say his right to informed consent had been violated, but unfortunately, by the time he litigated, the statute of limitations on that had already passed, and so so he became the basis of hundreds of millions of dollars, and he never got to see a dime. It's not actually completely dissimilar from the very famous Henrietta Lacks case, which
I was going
probably
to say it's a lot like
a lot like, but the Henrietta Lacks case never went to the state Supreme Court or a state Supreme Court. By the time the family was really aware of this, she had already passed away, and it was of future generations that were dealing with it. Whereas this was the living individual saying, "You're in the process of making money off of my body," and the courts basically said, "Yep."
Do you know if Moore was a white guy?
I believe so,
Yeah, another difference.
but he still lost.
Yep.
So anyway, so there may be problematic commercialization, which could be another ethical problem. If people use people's material, commercialize it in ways, and we've seen a lot of this where people use things to develop products that wind up becoming exorbitantly expensive. And thanks so much for helping us develop this. By the way, your population that helped gave rise to this won't ever be able to afford it and benefit from it.
Yep.
I do think it's interesting. I'll let you catch up. I do think it's interesting to think of the Belmont principles that you guys have already learned about, and to think about the Belmont principles and how they apply to all of this area of research, because I do think other people have written about this as well. Many people have talked about applying the Belmont principles, but I do think that they are a nice framework for a lot of the kinds of concerns that we've been talking about, as well as some others. So remember, the first principle is respect for individuals. These are not lexically ordered, but I'll just put them in the order in which they're usually presented. But respect for individuals. So the issues around whether or not we require consent, or not. So is consent something we require? Especially if you don't require consent, did the process of decision making involve public deliberation and community engagement? Because it's one thing to say, we just can't do this valuable research if we have to get consent from everybody. It's another to say, therefore, the public and everybody who we're studying, shut up and leave us alone. We scientists will be in control and decide what's best, right? So if you're not going to have consent, there ought to be at least some process of public deliberation and community engagement, to sort of play a role in the decision making about what kinds of research are done, and making sure that the research is responsive to the concerns of the people who are being studied. And then, of course, you also respect individuals by protecting their data as much as possible and acting as good stewards of that data to ensure that it actually is being used in ways that are actually of benefit to the people whose data is being utilized. So all of that falls under the respect for individuals. Then there's beneficence and non-maleficence. Remember, those two things are together in the Belmont Report. And so we've talked a lot about that already. What are the possible harms in a particular research proposal? Some of them, the harms are going to be quite minimal. Others, they could be potentially riskier. So depending on what you're doing, it's not hard to imagine that studying illicit drug use in a very small community is very different than studying it in a large community, which in turn is very different from studying the flu in San Francisco, a large population and a non-stigmatized trait. So there could be differences in harms, and you have to ask about whether benefits outweigh the risks and whether you're minimizing the risks as much as possible while maximizing the benefits as much as possible. All of those things fall under the beneficence and non-maleficence label.
Yep.
Okay, I'll let you catch up a little.
No, I'm catching up.
Okay, and then justice. So think about who benefits from the research or public health measures and who is placed at risk, whether that's privacy risks or other kinds of considerations. Who benefits versus who is exposed to risks. So the idea that those should be done equitably and the worries that that's not going to happen, that we're going to do things that might place one community at risk of harm in favor of another community, especially when we think about potential for group harms, not just individual harms, but the potential that we could find out things. This is something that lots of populations, indigenous populations, different race and ethnicity communities, disease advocacy communities, Ashkenazi Jews. There's lots of populations that are worried about the potential for group harms and stigmatizing effects of some of this research. So think about who benefits and who might be harmed because of some of this research, as well as whether or not the values of the community that are being studied are being respected in the way the research is being conducted.
That's interesting. It's interesting that the values of the community are not a respect for individuals issue. It's more of a justice issue.
And it's interesting because if you look at the common rule and the regulations, one of the reasons why IRB is local is precisely so that the individual local values of the research community, the community in which it's taking place, because remember, IRBs often have community representation,
Yep.
even though that usually means like a single individual handpicked by the institution. But at least theoretically, you're supposed to be responsive to community values in making those judgments, which is one of the reasons why an IRB could very legitimately say, this is acceptable in this community and not in this community. This community is very risk averse, and so they aren't going to let this kind of research happen. This community is really gung-ho on research and wants to cure disease as quickly as possible. They have a huge problem with some of these diseases, and so they're like totally gung-ho, and they're willing to accept higher levels of risk for the potential benefits compared to another community. So you need to be responsive and reflective of community values as you go forward. So
There you go.
So one question, is oversight the answer? So there, I just want to say this is an article that we have not given you by Devin Bowes and a whole bunch of colleagues, where they did and published in Environmental Science and Technology, where they did a very interesting study where they got a community of folks together to really do a systematic, structured they looked at the literature on ethics in all this space, somewhat similar to what I did to synthesize all this for you, and built a structured ethical review process for water-based testing in support of public health. And what's interesting is they use that, and it was essentially a Delphi process to really figure out which items, when we're thinking through the ethics of all these different things, are flags saying, this one's okay, this one you only need to have a minimal review required, but this one we probably should think about doing a review. This one we strongly recommend that you do a review. And so they basically did the study of this and looked at all these different factors like data stewardship and protection, community values, public decision making, whether it creates unfair disadvantage, the consequences of inaction, et cetera, all of which can be plugged into those different frameworks within the Belmont report we identified. And doing that, you can start to see it's an interesting framework for thinking about, like, when do we need some kind of oversight? But it's interesting because this is an example of something that we probably are not going to talk about very much, but we developed at Stanford for HAI, for human-centered AI, and we're starting to roll it out to other parts of Stanford, which is something called the ethical and societal review process, to augment the standard IRB review, because IRBs are very narrow. They really are only looking at risk to the research subjects in relation to anticipated benefits, including broad benefits. But risks are always just to the individual. But a lot of these kind of group harms or the potential for misuse, all of those kinds of things fall outside the scope of IRB. And so the communities are starting to recognize that there needs to be a supplemental review process, but we don't want it to be too regulatory. We don't want it to be a compliance function. And so at the same time, there's scale problems with this, but there's a lot of experimentation going on. This is an example of one such approach. Our ESR stuff, we published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences talking about our ethical societal review process and some data about how it changed the AI research people are doing. But I think there's a growing recognition that we need something beyond just the IRB, and that other thing really can't, if it turns into a compliance function, it will slow research down too much. These are not the kind of issues that really ought to be a compliance function, but it may be, this is something that we're going to be doing some research on. Maybe what we really need are scaffolding tools for researchers so that they can think about these kinds of things themselves and figure these things out themselves. So anyway, so to be determined as we collect more data about whether that approach where we rely on the investigators themselves for these kinds of issues works.
There you go. 54 minutes and 39 seconds of goodness.
Wow, I guess I was wrong that this was going to be a short one.
Well, it's good stuff, and this is an emerging hot area.
Okay.
So we should sign off. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to David. We'll see you in real life.
Wow, if I had known it was that long, I would have